Good morning. It's good to see you out. Before we begin our lesson, I did want to mention a thank you to Marilyn for the beautiful flowers. I guess those are technically flowers. They're plants anyway. But I know some of you would probably be happier if she had set them right up here, so you wouldn't have to look at me. But you can look at them instead. So that's good. But we thank her for bringing those. It makes it quite beautiful and wonderful to have those with us. Good to have you with us, and we're thankful those visiting as well. Hope that you'll stay afterwards and let us get to know you for a moment before you head on your way. This morning we want to talk about the cost of following Jesus. In Luke chapter 14, in verses 26 through 30, Jesus talks about how important it is to count. You didn't know Jesus was that big on counting, did you? But he tells us that it's very important for us to do some counting in our lives. And not just the mathematical kind of counting that we teach little children. We have to do some different kind of counting. We have to do some accounting. We have to do some measuring of risk and counting of the cost of things. He says there, beginning in verse 26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. He goes on as well, he describes the situation of a king going to battle and trying to figure out with the number of men he has, can he defeat this other king that has maybe more men? How can he be victorious? Or if he thinks he can't, then he'll try to get peace before it starts, before the war begins. And as we think about counting the cost, and he talks here about building a tower. Most of us have never built a tower, but many have built houses or other things, and certainly building is an expensive project. And many times, even when you count the cost, it winds up being more expensive than you thought. I know in the last couple of years, people gave some estimates for building things, and then because the prices of materials went up so much last year, their estimates didn't work out quite the way they thought they would. And it wound up being a lot more expensive than they thought it was going to be. Because everything went up because of inflation. Those things happen sometimes. And to some degree, in the physical realm, of course, you can't always predict the final cost because of things like that. But when it comes to spiritual things, God tells us what the costs are going to be. If we'll just study it and count it, and then we need to decide, do I have enough? Can I afford to pay the price that God is calling on me to pay for this? Now, interestingly enough, salvation, even though it's a free gift, it is the most expensive free gift you'll ever have. We got a free gift one time that was a car that cost us a lot of money because it had problems. It's not that kind of a cost, though. When God tells us there's going to be a cost, his cost that he's talking about is in the areas of us having to change the way we live our lives. It's in the area of us having to consider whether we're willing to give up the things we have to give up, whether we're willing to do the things he calls on us to do, whether we're willing to make the changes in our lives that he calls on us to make. The first thing that we want to consider in following Jesus as the cost is commitment. Some people aren't very good at making commitments. They'll make all sorts of promises, but not keep them. Can we follow through with what we say we'll do? Will we keep our word? Will we continue even when times get hard? We see in our country, with the divorce rates being what they are, that a lot of people aren't, when it gets a little tough, when problems arise, they're just ready to jump ship. They're just ready to quit and give up. Is that the way we'll be with God? We'll say, oh yeah, I'll follow you till death, or until it becomes uncomfortable, and then I'm going to quit. What kind of level of commitment are we willing to make? Jesus says there in Luke 14:26 that the first stage of that commitment is we've got to put him ahead of everybody else and everything else in our life. If you don't hate your father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters and even your own life, you can't be my disciple, he says. Now, I know, people argue all the time. Well, God said we're not supposed to hate. Well, that's not really the point Jesus is making here. He's not talking about a hatred where we want them to come to harm or we want them to die or anything like that. What he's saying is your attitude toward them compared to your attitude toward me is that I am so far above them in your thoughts and in your devotion, in your commitment. I come first so far ahead of everybody else that in comparison, it's hatred. It's like you hate them. You don't even love them anymore because you love me so much more. And we don't often want to do that. We want Jesus to be here and everybody else to be right up there, we want family to be right there next to him. Some people put family right up here and Jesus down here. That doesn't work. Jesus makes it clear he must come first. And even your own life. If you love living so much that you would deny him in order to keep living, and there were many in the first century who had to make that decision. Would I rather live and deny Jesus, or would I rather die and stay true to him? Most of us haven't ever even been in a position where that was a remote possibility in our lives. But in some ways that makes it more difficult for us. Sometimes it seems like I could muster up the courage one time if somebody had a gun to my head and I could say, no, I'm going to live for Jesus and I'm going to die for Jesus and you can do what you will. I'm not going to deny him. The problem is when I have to do that every single day for years and years, and every day say, I'm going to live today for Jesus. I'm going to be committed to him. I'm not going to deny him in my thoughts or my words or my actions today. And how many times do we fail? How many days are there where we don't live up to that commitment that we should? Like Peter did. Maybe we deny that we even know him. Maybe we don't say it in those many words like Peter did, but maybe in the actions, the people look and say, well, a follower of Christ certainly wouldn't act that way. They must not really be following Christ. We need to be sure that we're ready to face the difficulties that come when we have a commitment to someone, and in this case, our commitment to Christ. Romans 12 and verse 1. Paul says there, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. We need to be giving our lives, not in death, but in life, a living sacrifice. That's commitment. You've probably seen the little comic of the pig and the chicken. And the chicken says, hey, I think we should do something nice for the farmer. How about we give him a breakfast of bacon and eggs? And the pig says, well, from you, that's just a contribution, but from me, that would take a total commitment. And the thing is, see, Jesus doesn't just ask us to give him a contribution from our life. He calls on us to make that total commitment. To present our bodies as a living sacrifice to him. In Matthew chapter 4 and verse 10, Jesus says to Satan as he's being tempted there, as Satan wants him to bow down and worship him. And Jesus says, get away from me, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. We've got to worship God and serve God, and only worship and serve God. Nobody else, nothing else. Not our family, not our job, not any possession that we have, not our own life, not anything is to take the place of God in our lives. But secondly, when we consider following Jesus, we have to consider obedience. Obeying can be a difficult thing sometimes. We often obey the things we like to obey and don't obey the things we don't like to obey. I won't ask anybody whether they sped on the way to church this morning. Sometimes we think certain things, oh, well, I don't have to obey that. And sometimes we think that in the area of the commands that Jesus has given. Oh, well, that's a little one. That one's too hard. I don't want to have to do that. I'll obey these commands over here, but those over there, those are too hard. I'm not going to do that. Jesus doesn't tell us to take your pick and pick your favorite commands and follow them. It's not like a cafeteria. It's not like the potluck dinner where you can just pick and choose which thing you want to put on your plate. When Jesus gives us commands to obey, we're to obey all of those commands. Hebrews 5:9, talking about Jesus, says he's been perfected. He became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Not to all who obey him some or partially obey him, but to those who obey him, he is the author of eternal salvation. But we've got to obey him all the way, not just part of the way. 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 5 tells us just how far we need to go in our obedience. It says, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought. I don't know about you, I have a lot of thoughts during a given day. Some of them very clear, some of them very confused, some of them just wondering what I was thinking a minute ago that I've forgotten. But I have a lot of thoughts during the day, and you probably do too. Every thought is to be brought, he says there, into captivity to the obedience of Christ. He said not only should we obey Christ and everything, but we ought not ever even think about disobeying him. We ought not even think a thought contrary to God's will for us, contrary to obeying Christ. That's hard. That's a lifelong challenge right there, to bring every single thought throughout the day into the captivity of the obedience of Christ. To make every thought obey Christ. That's tough. But that's what he calls on. He calls on us to go all the way in our obedience in every area of our life. Even down, not just our actions that people see, not just the words that we speak that people hear, but all the way deep down into our heart, to our thoughts and our feelings, everything deep inside us. We need to obey him. And then, in following Jesus, we need to think about the cost of self-denial we are by nature born pretty selfish. A little baby, when that baby's hungry or scared or cold or needs their diaper changed, they do not consider anyone else in the world. They only consider what they need and what they want. They're hungry and it's 3 a.m. They don't care. They want to eat. And they scream until you give them something to eat. They're pretty selfish. They don't care if you haven't eaten, if they're cold or they're wet and need their diaper. They're going to scream and fuss and cry until you take care of them. And some of us never outgrow that. We stay that way our whole life. We just think about me, me, me. What I want to do for myself and what everybody else ought to do for me. But we can't be that way and follow Christ, because we've got to deny self and give up our desires. Jesus says there in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 24, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up the cross and follow me. You've got to deny yourself. You've got to say no to yourself, because self wants a lot of things. I don't know about you. Myself wanted to stay in bed another 30 minutes or an hour this morning. And I had to say, no, we're going to get up. We're going to get ready and we're going to go worship God instead. And a lot of times myself might have wanted to spend more of my money on other things instead of bringing it to give to the work of the Lord. Myself might want to do things that God said don't do. I know there are times at work when I'm frustrated with people, because people can be frustrating, believe it or not. If you've never met people, you might not know that. But if you've met people, you know how frustrating they can be. And there are times myself wants to tell them off. Myself sometimes wants to say some mean and nasty things to them. Maybe even myself might want to curse at them and cuss them. And I have to say, no, self, you can't do that, because you're following Christ. You have to deny self. Philippians 2:21 talks about the nature of many people in this world. For all seek their own, and not the things which are of Christ Jesus. But if we're going to follow Christ, we can't be like the rest of the world. We have to say no to self. We have to stop seeking our own desires and wants and wishes and seek His. Follow after the things that are of Christ. And it's not easy. It's difficult every day. But we have to deny self. And then, of course, we have to take up the cross. You know what a cross was used for, right? A cross was not just used to punish someone, but to torture them until they died. And so when Jesus tells us to take up our cross in Matthew 16:24 and in Luke 14:27, take up your cross and follow me. Anyone who does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. When Jesus says, you've got to follow me to death, not just deny self and say no to self, but actually put self to death every day so that I can live to Christ. Paul talked about that. He says that he is dead in Christ, and he doesn't live any longer, but now Christ is living in him. And that's what we have to do. We have to put our selfish, willful, stubborn, self-worshiping self to death. We have to execute that wicked person that we wanted to be, that many are in this world. We have to execute that and bring to life and allow God to bring to life in us a new man, one that is becoming more and more like Jesus Christ every day. That's difficult. That's a high cost. The commitment, the obedience, the self-denial, the self-execution in order to live for Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. That is expensive. That's a high cost. And to some, that may seem like too high of a cost. But if you think that that's too high of a cost, let's consider now the cost of not following him. Let's look at the other side of the coin. What if I say, well, I don't want to pay that cost? Because we're going to have to pay a cost either way. That's why Jesus said, count the cost. Compare. Which way do you want to do it? You got the choice. You can follow me or not follow me. What's the cost of following me? Here it is. We've looked at that. What's the cost of not following Jesus? Let's look at that now. The cost of not following Jesus is condemnation. John 3 and verse 18, he who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. If you don't believe in Jesus, you are condemned. You stand condemned. In Romans 8 and verse 1, though it says, there is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So if you've paid the cost of following Jesus, there's no condemnation for you. But if you don't want to pay that cost, then you're going to have to pay the cost of condemnation. You will be condemned. There is the cost of outer darkness awaiting you in your future. Matthew 25 and verse 30, Jesus telling this parable of a description of what things are going to be like on the final day. And he says, and cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. In Matthew 22 and verse 13, another parable that he told, he says, then the king said to his servant, bind him hand and foot, take him away and cast him into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. 2 times in these 4 chapters between Matthew 22 and 25. 2 times here Jesus warns. There is something awaiting those who do not do what God, the King, the Master, wants them to do. The one who doesn't pay the cost of following Jesus is going to be cast into outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And those who are cast there will find that they're the ones weeping and gnashing their teeth before long. And then, of course, there is the cost of separation from God. No matter how miserable things get in this world, and honestly, there are some pretty miserable things that happen to people in this world. Some people suffer greatly on this earth. But in spite of whatever suffering might happen here on this earth, the goodness of God can still be seen in a little bit of compassion from another human being, in a sunrise or a sunset, in a warmer day or a cooler day, in the flowers and the trees. There are always little things around us, no matter how bad things get, that show us the goodness of God in this world, no matter how bad it gets. But if we are truly separated from God, there is no goodness, no kindness, no compassion, nothing but wickedness and evil and suffering. 2 Thessalonians 1:9 says those who have rejected Christ, who have not obeyed the gospel, he says in verse 7 and following. In verse 9 he says, these shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. Everlasting destruction. You know, to be destroyed is one thing. That'd be bad. But to be destroyed in an everlasting way, I can't even imagine what that would be like, can you? Matthew 25 and verse 41. He pictures the judgment day, and he says to those that are on the left hand, the judge, the king, God, will say, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. Everlasting fire, separated from God forever. I don't even want to try to imagine what that would be like. And of course then, that is describing the fourth cost of not following Jesus, torment in hell. Again in Matthew 25 and verse 46 says, and these will go away into everlasting punishment. You know, most of us can stand almost any punishment if we know it's coming to an end and we know that it's going to be over with. But everlasting punishment, everlasting torment, everlasting pain and suffering. Luke 16:22 and 23, as Jesus describes to the rich man and the beggar, says, so it was that the beggar died, and he was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. But the rich man also died and was buried. And being in torment in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. He's being tormented. And he even said, I'm in torment in these flames. I've burned myself. You ever burn yourself? That's not a pleasant feeling. Have you ever burned yourself bad enough that the burn continues to burn? That it's not just, ow, that was hot, it burned, but that days later it still burned? Maybe a bad sunburn, that days later it was still hurting, and then it peels off, and then you heal up and you get and it feels better then. But what about a burn that never heals? What about a burning that just continues on and on? It's hard to imagine. Certainly don't even want to imagine it. But that is going to be the reality for those who don't pay the cost of following Jesus, but instead choose the cost of not following him. So have you counted the cost? The cost of following Jesus, the commitment, the obedience, the self-denial, and taking up your cross. Or the cost of not following Jesus, condemnation, outer darkness, separation from God, and torment in hell. If we've counted the cost accurately, then we will decide as Paul did in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 8, yea, doubtless, I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but garbage, that I may win Christ. when you put those two costs side by side and do a cost analysis, it's pretty obvious, or at least it should be pretty obvious, which cost is worth paying. And the good news about it is the cost of following Jesus will pay off with reward in heaven. If you're here and you haven't counted the cost, or maybe you've been paying the cost of not following Jesus, or are on the verge of having to pay the cost of not following Christ, maybe it's time to change your mind and pay a different cost and start following Him. If you have a need to respond to God's invitation for any reason, please do so as we stand and as we sing.